The Battle of Borodino, fought on September 7, 1812, was a major engagement in the Napoleonic Wars during the French invasion of Russia. Napoleon's Grande Armée Écoutée launched an attack against the Russian army, driving the latter back from their initial positions but failing to score a decisive victory. Both armies were exhausted after the battle and the Russians withdrew from the field the following day. Borodino represented the last Russian effort at stopping the French advance on Moscow, which fell a week later, but because the Russian army was not badly beaten enough to be rendered ineffective, the French would have no clear way of bringing Tsar Alexander to peace, resulting ultimately in the retreat from Moscow and the defeat of the French invasion. After a series of Russian retreats at the beginning of the campaign, the nobility grew alarmed about the advancing French troops and forced the Tsar to sack the army's commander. Barclay de Tolly, Mikhail Kutuzov was appointed as his replacement. In a final attempt to save Moscow, the Russians made a stand near the village of Borodino, west of the town of Mozhaysk. They fortified their positions and dug in, waiting for the French to attack. The Russian right wing occupied ideal defensive terrain, so the French tried to press the Russian left for much of the battle. The highlight of the fighting became the bloody struggle for the large Raevsky redoubt near the village of Borodino itself. The French managed to capture this redoubt late into the day, gradually forcing the rest of the Russian army to pull back as well. The Russians suffered terrible casualties during the fighting, losing over a third of their army. French losses were also heavy, further exacerbating the logistical difficulties that Napoleon encountered in the campaign. The exhausted French forces, and the lack of information on the condition of the Russian army, persuaded Napoleon to remain on the battlefield with his army instead of ordering the kind of vigorous pursuit reminiscent of previous campaigns. Napoleon's Imperial Guard, the only unit on the battlefield that saw no fighting, was available to swing into action at a moment's notice. In refusing to commit the Guard, some historians believe, he lost his one chance to destroy the Russian army and to win the campaign. The capture of Moscow proved a hollow reward since the Russians had no intention of negotiating with Napoleon for peace. The French evacuated Russia's spiritual capital in October and conducted a difficult retreat that only ended in December, by which point the remainder of the Grande Armée Écoutée had largely unraveled. Historical reports of the battle differed significantly depending on whether they originated from supporters of the French or Russian side. Factional fighting among senior officers within each army also led to conflicting accounts and disagreements over the roles of particular officers. Background: Napoleon's invasion of Russia. The French Grande Armée Écoutée began its invasion of Russia on June 16, 1812. In response, Emperor Alexander I proclaimed a patriotic war and prepared to face the French. According to the plan of German General Karl Ludwig von Pfuel, the Russian troops under the command of Count Michael Barclay de Tolly had to face the Grande Armée Écoutée in the Vilnius region. The remaining troops under General Pyotr Bagration would launch an attack to the French southern flank and rear. However, Pfuel's plan soon proved to be a fatal mistake, as the enormous Grande Armée Écoutée was more than enough to separate and crush both Russian armies at the same time. Furthermore, the participation of Tsar Alexander I as commander caused more chaos in the Russian army. The Russian forces massed along the Polish frontier were obliged to fall back in the face of the swift French advance. Napoleon advanced from Vitebsk, hoping to catch the Russian army in the open where he could annihilate it. The French army, however, was not positioned well for an extended overland campaign. It was 925 kilometers from its nearest logistic base at Kovno. The extended French supply lines were vulnerable and Cossacks, like cavalry, guerrilla forces, and even French deserters attacked and seriously depleted French supply columns. The Central French force under Napoleon's direct command had crossed the Niemen with 286,000 men, but by the time of the battle was reduced to 161,475, mostly through starvation and disease. Nonetheless, the prospect of a decisive battle lured Napoleon further into Russia and further stretched his supply lines. Meanwhile, infighting between Barclay's subordinates repeatedly prevented the Russian commander from committing his forces to battle. Barclay's fellow generals and the Russian court viewed the constant retreat as a reluctance to fight. Consequently, he was removed from command and replaced by Prince Mikhail Kutuzov on August 29, 1812. Even though the 67-year-old General Kutuzov was not seen by his contemporaries as the equal of Napoleon, he possessed the ability to muster a good defense. He was favored over Barclay because he was ethnically Russian, whereas Barclay was of Scottish descent and officers subordinate to Barclay could accept Kutuzov, thereby uniting the army. On the 18th of August, Kutuzov arrived at Sarajevo to greet the army. After taking over the army, Kutuzov organized a strong rearguard army under the command of General Konovnitsyn, and then ordered the Russian army to prepare for an incoming battle. Kutuzov understood that Barclay's decision to retreat was correct, but the Russian troops could not accept further retreat. A battle had to occur in order to save the morale of the soldiers. The new commander had still not managed to establish a defensive position when the armies were within 125 kilometers of Moscow. He then ordered another retreat to Jizahatisk on August 30. By that time, the ratio of French to Russian forces had shrunk from 3-1 to 5-4. The time to fight had come. A defensive line was established in the best available position before reaching Moscow near the village of Borodino. The Borodino field was too open and had too few natural obstacles to protect the Russian center and left flank, but it was chosen due to the protection provided by the Kolika River, because it blocked both Smolensk-Moscow roads, and because there were no better locations. Starting on September 3, Kutuzov strengthened the line with earthworks, including the Ryevsky redoubt in the center right of the line and 3 open, arrow-shaped Bagration flèches on the left. Battle of Shevardino Redoubt. The initial Russian position, which stretched south of the new Smolensk highway, was anchored on its left by a pentagonal earthwork redoubt erected on a mound near the village of Shevardino. But soon, the Russian generals realized that their left wing was too exposed and too vulnerable. So, the Russian line was moved back from this position, but the redoubt remained manned. Kutuzov stating that the fortification was manned simply to delay the advance of the French forces. Historian Dmitry Buturlin reports that it was used as an observation point to determine the course of the French advance. Historians Whitner and Ratch, and many others, reported it was used as a fortification to threaten the French right flank. Despite being beyond effective reach of guns of the period, the Chief of Staff of the Russian First Army, Alexei Petrovich Yermolov, related in his memoirs that the Russian left was shifting position when the French army showed up sooner than expected. Thus the Battle of Shevardino became a delaying effort to shield the redeployment of the Russian left. The construction of the redoubt and its purpose is still disputed by historians to this day. The struggle opened on September 5 when King Joachim Murat's French forces met Konovnitsyn's Russians in a massive cavalry clash. The Russians eventually retreating to the Koloskoye cloister when the flank was threatened. Fighting resumed the next day, but Konovnitsyn again retreated when Viceroy Eugene de Buhamai's 4th Corps arrived, threatening his flank. The Russians withdrew to the Shevardino redoubt, where a pitched battle ensued. King Murat led Nant-Sauti's 1st Cavalry Corps and Montbrun's 2nd Cavalry Corps, supported by Companzer's division of Louis Nicolas Davout's 1st Infantry Corps against the redoubt. Simultaneously, Prince Joseph Poniatowski's infantry attacked the position from the south. Fighting was heavy and very fierce, as the Russians refused to retreat until Kutuzov personally ordered them to do so. The French captured the redoubt, with the cost of 4,000–5,000 French and 6,000 Russian casualties. The small redoubt was destroyed and covered by the dead and dying of both sides. The unexpected French advance from the west and the fall of the Borodino redoubt threw the Russian formation into disarray. Since the left flank of their defensive position had collapsed, Russian forces withdrew to the east, constructing a makeshift position centered around the village of Utitsa. The left flank of the Russian position was therefore ripe for a flanking attack. Opposing forces. A series of reforms to the Russian army had begun in 1802, creating regiments of 3 battalions, each battalion having 4 companies. The defeats of Austerlitz, Eylau, and Friedland led to important additional reforms. Though continuous fighting in the course of 3 wars with France, 2 with Sweden, and 2 with the Ottoman Empire had not allowed time for these to be fully implemented and absorbed, a divisional system was introduced in 1806, and corps were established in 1812. Prussian influence may be seen in the organizational setup. By the time of Borodino, the Russian army had changed greatly from the force which met the French in 1805 to 1807. Russian forces present at the battle included 180 infantry battalions, 164 cavalry squadrons, 20 Cossack regiments, and 55 artillery batteries. In total, the Russians fielded 155,200 troops. There were 10,000 Cossacks as well as 33,000 Russian militiamen in the area who did not participate in the battle. After the battle, the militia units were broken up to provide reinforcements to depleted regular infantry battalions. Of the 637 Russian artillery pieces, 300 were held in reserve, and many of these were never committed to the battle. According to historian Alexander Mackay-Baridza, the French army remained the finest army of its day by a good margin. It had been a legacy of the French king, and its fusion with the formations of the French Revolution and Napoleon's reforms had transformed it into a military machine that had dominated Europe since 1805. Each corps of the French army was in fact its own mini-army capable of independent action. French forces included 214 battalions of infantry, 317 squadrons of cavalry and 587 artillery pieces, totaling of 128,000 troops. However, the French Imperial Guard, which consisted of 30 infantry battalions, 27 cavalry squadrons and 109 artillery pieces, a total of 18,500 troops, was also never committed to action.